I told you all he doesn't belong here. Get him out! The woman's voice sliced through the cabin air. Her name was Brielle, and her fury was aimed at the small black boy seated in first class. In an instant, the calm of the cabin shattered. Voices rose in a chaotic chorus, and the glow of phone screens filled the air as passengers began recording. Flight attendants rushed forward, their pleas for calm lost in the growing uproar. "Somebody call 911," another passenger yelled. "This kid needs to be arrested, now!" Soon, airport police boarded the plane, their presence confirming the grim turn of events. Little Michael Ashworth, the boy at the center of the storm, looked up, his vision blurred by tears. He saw only a ring of angry, distorted faces closing in on him. He was 8 years old, overwhelmed and terrified, unable to comprehend how his quiet flight to Boston had devolved into this waking nightmare. His innocent eyes, wide with confusion, scanned the crowd as he whispered the most heartbreaking words imaginable. "I didn't do anything. Please." But in less than 5 minutes, something would shift. The very woman demanding his arrest would be begging for mercy, her world collapsing around her as she realized the magnitude of her mistake. This is the story of how one woman's prejudice and her desperate attempt to frame an innocent child led to a downfall of spectacular proportions. To understand this moment of chaos, however, we must go back 3 hours to a time when this flight was just another ordinary trip from Los Angeles to Boston. Michael Ashworth was not just any 8-year-old. He lived in Beverly Hills, and as he walked through the airport in a crisp shirt and perfectly pressed khakis, he looked like any other well-to-do child traveling with family. But Michael was traveling alone, and what he carried with him was extraordinary. While other children his age were lost in video games or cartoons, Michael was quietly absorbed in doctoral-level calculus problems, equations that would challenge PhD students at the world's top universities. He wasn't just a gifted child doing advanced homework. He was a certified genius whose abilities had stunned professors across the country. Michael wasn't flying to Boston for a vacation. He was the son of Donovan Ashworth, the billionaire CEO of Ashworth Technologies. More importantly, he was on his way to be inducted into the Mathematics Hall of Fame, the youngest person in history to receive such an honor. He had achieved what most mathematicians only dream of in a lifetime. As Michael settled into seat 1A, he pulled out his tablet and returned to his world of numbers, humble, quiet, and completely unaware that his passion for mathematics would soon be the only thing anchoring his sanity. But Michael wasn't the only passenger with a story. In another seat, Brielle Covington, a 45-year-old woman, was stewing in her own quiet desperation. Brielle was a mid-level marketing manager at Ashworth Technologies, the very company owned by Michael's father, though she had no idea. Her life was unraveling. Recently demoted after what her supervisors called disastrous quarterly results, she was flying to a conference in Boston in a last-ditch effort to save her career. What made Brielle truly dangerous, however, were two things: a deep-seated racist belief in a natural social order, and a second, untraceable burner phone she kept for emergencies. This wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. As she boarded the plane and saw Michael sitting confidently in first class, every prejudice she harbored began to boil. In her mind, that child had no right to be there. They weren't the only ones on that flight whose actions would matter. In the first-class cabin, flight attendant Temperance Rodriguez was preparing for her shift. She was a woman who believed in fairness, ready to defend any passenger from injustice. In seat 3C, a quiet man named Marcus Stone appeared to be just another businessman, but he was an undercover federal air marshal, trained to see what others missed. Elsewhere, Crawford Chen, an elderly businessman, was already forming judgments based on appearances, while Serafina Williams, a young mother, held her phone, always ready to record. As Flight 447 prepared for takeoff, none of them knew they were about to become players in a drama that would expose the ugliest facets of human nature, and prove that truth eventually finds the light. The curtain rose when Brielle Covington decided an 8-year-old boy did not deserve his seat. She walked directly to Michael and stood over him, her voice laced with an aggressive entitlement. "Excuse me, you're in my seat. Move to the back where you belong." Michael looked up from his equations, startled. He held out his boarding pass, his voice polite. "Ma'am, this is seat 1A. It says so right here." But Brielle wasn't interested in facts. Her prejudiced mind had already passed judgment. I don't care what that fake paper says, she snarled, her voice rising and turning heads. Children like you don't fly first class. I'm a business executive. I deserve this seat. At that moment, Temperance Rodriguez, the flight attendant, intervened. Ma'am, I verified his ticket. The young man's reservation is perfectly legitimate. This only fueled Brielle's rage. The racial venom that spilled from her next was shocking. This is ridiculous, she shrieked, her face flushed. Check his credit card. Check his ID. There's no way his family can afford this. It's probably stolen. Tears welled in Michael's eyes, born not of anger, but of a profound and painful confusion. My dad's assistant bought my ticket, he said, his voice trembling. I'm going to a math competition. But the poison had already spread. Crawford Chen, the elderly businessman, eyed Michael with suspicion. The lady has a point, he remarked. It's highly unusual for a child to be alone in first class. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the cabin. Michael felt the atmosphere shift, the weight of their collective suspicion pressing down on him. He was suddenly an outsider, his skin color an indictment. Sensing her advantage, Brielle pounced. Exactly. Something is very wrong here. I demand you move him. This was no longer about a seat. It was about Brielle's twisted worldview, a world where a young black child sitting in first class was a disruption to the natural order. And so, as the confrontation escalated, little Michael Ashworth, a genius on his way to receive the highest honor in his field, sat working on calculus problems while tears streamed silently down his cheeks. He had no idea that the woman screaming at him was an employee of his father's company. He had no idea she was about to commit a crime so calculated, so evil, it would shatter her life forever. Brielle was about to frame an innocent child for theft. What happened next was a masterclass in calculated cruelty. Frustrated that the flight attendant continued to defend Michael, Brielle excused herself to the restroom, feigning the need to compose herself. But inside, her mind was racing. She pulled out her second phone, the untraceable burner. It was an older, clean device, devoid of any personal data. A wicked plan began to form. She returned to her seat, and as Michael quietly organized his worksheets, Brielle pretended to stumble, bumping into the boy. Oh, so sorry, sweetie, she cooed, her voice dripping with false sincerity. In that brief, orchestrated moment of clumsiness, she slipped the burner phone deep into his backpack. The trap was set. Now she began to build her narrative, turning to nearby passengers with a look of feigned concern. I just feel so bad for that boy, she said, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. Where are his parents? It seems like neglect. What kind of family lets an 8-year-old travel all alone? 10 minutes passed. Then her performance began. She started frantically patting her pockets, searching her purse, looking under her seat. My phone, she cried out, loud enough for everyone to hear. Oh God, my phone is missing. It has all my work contacts. My life is on that phone. Concerned passengers looked up. This seemed genuine. I had it right here when I sat down, she continued, her voice rising in panic. The only person who's been near my area is... She paused for dramatic effect, then pointed a trembling finger directly at Michael Ashworth. That boy. When he was moving around earlier, he must have taken it. Michael looked up, his face a mask of bewildered innocence. Ma'am, I haven't touched anything of yours. I've been working on my problems. But Brielle's earlier whispers had done their work. Crawford Chen looked at Michael sternly. Son, maybe you picked it up by accident. Even Serafina Williams, the young mother, chimed in. Maybe just check your bag to be sure. The final blow came when Temperance, the flight attendant who had defended him, now looked at him with concern. Michael, honey, could you please just check your backpack? With tears now streaming down his face, Michael opened his bag. The burner phone tumbled out, landing on the carpet with a soft thud that echoed like a gunshot. Silence. Then, Brielle erupted. There it is! He stole my phone! Thief! She shrieked, her voice triumphant. The cabin exploded. I can't believe this, one passenger shouted. Criminals start young, said another. Call the police right now! The mob had found its victim. Michael's world collapsed. He broke down completely, his small body racked with sobs. I didn't take it, he pleaded. I promise. I don't know how it got there. But no one believed him. Not a single person stood up for the child. What none of them knew was that someone had been watching. Someone had seen everything, and soon the truth would be exposed in the most spectacular way imaginable. The chaos in the first-class cabin had reached a fever pitch. "Get him off this plane," someone screamed. "I can't believe they let people like this in first class," another voice added. The flight attendants' attempts to restore order were futile. The mob had taken over, and in the center of it all sat 8-year-old Michael Ashworth, his small body shaking with uncontrollable sobs. The brilliant child who, just hours before, had been peacefully navigating the elegant world of advanced mathematics, was now being treated like a hardened criminal. The irony was devastating. A boy whose mind operated on a level few could comprehend was being condemned by a jury of his supposed peers, all for a crime he didn't commit. Then the captain's voice cut through the intercom, sharp and authoritative. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be making an emergency landing in Denver due to a serious security incident on board." A ripple of smug satisfaction went through the cabin. "Good," one woman said, crossing her arms. "It's about time." Crawford Chen nodded, his initial suspicions now, in his mind, fully validated. The cabin buzzed with a dark, carnival-like energy as passengers congratulated themselves on their role in catching a thief. Brielle Covington sat like a queen on her throne, basking in her triumph. She turned to her neighbors, shaking her head with performative sadness. "I just feel so sorry for his parents," she said, her voice laced with malice disguised as concern. But Michael heard none of it. He sat small and terrified, utterly alone. His tiny hands, when not wiping away tears, returned to his tablet. He retreated into the one place he felt safe, the world of calculus. In a world that had gone insane, numbers were his only sanctuary. They didn't lie. They didn't judge. They were constant, logical, and true. He was oblivious that his father was likely already moving heaven and earth to reach him. Oblivious that some of the country's most formidable lawyers were being mobilized. Oblivious that corporate security teams were, at that very moment, triangulating his position. All the boy knew was that every adult around him, the very people meant to protect children, to be responsible and fair, was convinced he was a criminal. The psychological wound inflicted upon him in those moments is nearly impossible to quantify. Imagine being 8 years old and watching your entire perception of the world shatter in a single afternoon. Imagine the lesson that your skin color could be wielded as evidence against you. Imagine discovering that your intellect, your accomplishments, your very character meant nothing once adults had decided what to believe. The plane touched down on the Denver tarmac with a hard thud, a sound that seemed to echo the finality of the situation. It reverberated through the cabin like a judge's gavel, sealing Michael's fate, or so it seemed. Within minutes, a cordon of emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft, their red and blue lights painting the cabin in silent, strobing flashes. Police cars, ambulances, fire trucks, the full response protocol for a high-threat situation, all for a child. From his window seat, Michael watched the lights spin, the official vehicles converge, the uniformed personnel assemble on the tarmac below. Then came a sound that would forever echo in the nightmares of anyone who heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, authoritative, pounding down the jet bridge like the drums of war. Each step was a nail in the coffin of his innocence. Detective Rivera and Officer Thompson boarded the aircraft, their expressions grim and unyielding. These were not airline officials or mall cops. They were career lawmen treating this as a high-stakes felony, not the systematic persecution of a child. Their hands hovered near their weapons as their eyes scanned the cabin for threats. Passengers sat up straighter, suddenly cast in a real-life drama, a story they would tell for years. The officer's very posture broadcast the seriousness of the matter, reinforcing the collective delusion that their suspicions about Michael had been correct. Brielle seized her moment, launching into the performance of a lifetime. She pointed a dramatic finger at Michael, as if identifying a long-hunted fugitive. "Officers, that boy stole my phone," she declared, her voice thick with a theatrical outrage that would have been comical if it weren't destroying a life. Everyone saw it fall from his bag. "I caught him red-handed. He's been lying this whole time, but the evidence speaks for itself." The passengers around her nodded in vigorous agreement, their faces masks of righteous indignation. They had cast themselves as witnesses to justice, key players in a triumph of good over evil. In truth, They were accomplices to a sickening act of racial persecution, but they saw only heroism in the mirror. We all saw it, added Crawford Chen, his elderly voice carrying the weight of assumed authority. The phone fell right out of his backpack, clear as day. A murmur of consensus rippled through the cabin, a chorus of false witnesses sealing Michael's guilt. What happened next was a fundamental corruption of everything a justice system is supposed to protect. Despite Michael's age, despite being a small boy who still needed help cutting his food, the officers made the decision to place him in restraints. Picture it, child-sized handcuffs being fastened around the slender wrists of a mathematical genius whose only crime was being black in first class. "You're under arrest for theft," Officer Thompson stated, his voice the cold, detached monotone of a man who has already passed judgment. He spoke to the sobbing 60-pound child with the same formality he would use for a hardened career criminal. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney." The Miranda rights. Read to an 8-year-old. A child who should have been preoccupied with homework and playground games was instead being inducted into the world of violent felons. The profound wrongness of the scene seemed lost on everyone but Michael himself, who was hyperventilating through his tears, his world collapsing around him. But he wasn't silent. His small, broken voice cut through the cabin like a shard of glass. "I want my daddy," he pleaded. "Please, call my daddy. I didn't do anything wrong. Please, somebody call my daddy." The raw, primal desperation in his voice, the instinctive cry of a terrified child for his father, should have shattered every heart on that plane. The sight of a small boy in handcuffs, tears streaming down his face, should have triggered every protective instinct a decent human being possesses. Instead, most passengers watched with a grim satisfaction. Some were already filming, composing the social media posts in their heads. Others shook their heads in feigned sadness, murmuring about the failings of modern parents. The cruelty was breathtaking. For a fleeting moment, a flicker of humanity seemed to cross Officer Thompson's face. Perhaps it was the sight of the tiny wrists in the cuffs or the sheer terror in the boy's eyes. Whatever the reason, he reluctantly agreed. With hands that shook so badly he could barely hold the phone, Michael recited his father's number, a number drilled into him since he was 4 for just such an emergency, though no one could have conceived of one like this. "Sir, this is the Denver Police Department," Officer Thompson said into his radio. "We have your son, Michael, in custody. He's been arrested for theft on Flight 407. "Yes, sir. We'll wait." But something shifted during that call. The officer's tone changed. His brow furrowed. His posture stiffened. There was a long pause. He asked the person on the other end to repeat something, then to spell a name. None of the passengers noticed these subtle cues. But had they been watching, they would have seen Officer Thompson's professional confidence waver. They would have seen him exchange a loaded glance with Detective Rivera before quietly radioing for the flight's passenger manifest. What followed were 20 minutes of pure agony, 20 minutes that felt like an eternity and aged Michael by a lifetime. The plane sat on the tarmac, a makeshift prison. Michael remained handcuffed, his quiet sobs punctuated by the rustle of the math worksheets in his lap, the only thing anchoring him to reality. And Brielle? She was basking in her victory, parading through the first-class cabin like a conquering hero. "This is what happens when parents don't teach right from wrong," she announced to anyone who would listen. "They start young. Someone needed to nip this in the bud before he became a real danger." She spoke of an 8-year-old as if he were a hardened sociopath positioning herself as both victim and savior, a masterclass in narcissistic manipulation. But here is what Brielle, the passengers, and even the police didn't yet understand. During those 20 minutes, an extraordinary chain of events had been set in motion. Phone calls that move mountains were being made. Corporate security teams, legal departments, and private jets were being mobilized with the ruthless efficiency only billions of dollars can command. Justice was coming for Michael Ashworth, and it was coming in a way that would obliterate everyone who had a hand in his persecution. The reversal of fortune about to unfold would be so complete, so devastatingly poetic, it would restore one's faith in karma itself. The sound began as a distant rumble, growing rapidly into a roar that cut through the airport noise. Three black SUVs with heavily tinted windows raced across the tarmac at breathtaking speed, their tires screaming on the asphalt. These were not ordinary vehicles. They were the armored transports of the global elite. They screeched to a halt beside the plane. Car doors opened and closed with a percussive slam. Stepping out of the lead vehicle was a man who radiated power, wealth, and a barely contained fury. Donovan Ashworth stood 6'2", dressed in a suit that cost more than most cars. But it was not his clothes that commanded the cabin. It was his presence. This was a man who moved markets with a word. And at this moment, every ounce of his formidable power was focused on his son. Behind him emerged a small army of professionals, corporate security moving with military precision, and lawyers whose briefcases contained enough legal firepower to level a city. The footsteps that now echoed down the jet bridge were different. They carried an authority that bent the world to their rhythm. When Donovan Ashworth stepped onto the plane, the atmosphere crackled and changed. Conversations died. Passengers fell silent. Even the police officers stood straighter, sensing a fundamental shift in the balance of power. His voice, when he spoke, was cold steel. "Officers, I'm Donovan Ashworth. That's my son you have in handcuffs." The name hung in the air. Most passengers were still processing the arrival of this powerful man claiming the young thief as his son. But Brielle Covington heard the name, and her world began to visibly crumble. The color drained from her face. Her mouth fell open, her eyes wide with a dawning, abject terror. "Mr. Ashworth?" she whispered. "Oh my God, you're—" She couldn't finish. The little boy she had tormented and framed was not just any child. He was the son of her company's CEO, the owner, the man who could ruin her with a single word. Crawford Chen gasped. "That's the CEO of Ashworth Technologies. He's a billionaire." A wave of panic swept the cabin. Passengers who had been so self-righteous moments before now shrank into their seats. The phones that had been recording the drama were hastily put away, but the bombshells had only just begun. The quiet passenger in seat 3C, a man who had observed the entire ordeal in silence, suddenly stood. Marcus Stone had been so unassuming that most had forgotten he was there. Now he reached into his jacket and produced credentials that made Detective Rivera's eyes go wide. "Agent Marcus Stone, Federal Air Marshal," he announced, his voice carrying the calm, unmistakable authority of federal law. "I've been observing this flight and I need to inform you that I have witnessed a serious federal crime." Absolute silence. Every eye was on Agent Stone. "Ma'am," he said, fixing Brielle with a stare that could melt steel. "I have video evidence of you planting that phone in the child's backpack." Brielle's face turned a sickly green. The elaborate lie she had constructed was collapsing. Agent Stone held up his phone, displaying crystal-clear footage of her stumble. From his angle, it was no accident. The video showed her hand deliberately dipping into Michael's backpack, carefully planting the burner phone. A calculated, methodical frame-up. "Here's footage of you placing your burner phone in his bag," Agent Stone announced to the officers. "I have the entire incident documented." Desperation made Brielle's voice shrill. "That's impossible. He stole it. This is a setup." But the agent was relentless. "Furthermore," he continued, "this phone was factory reset 3 days ago. It has no contacts, no data, no usage history. It's a throwaway purchased for this purpose. This was premeditated fraud." The evidence was irrefutable, delivered by a witness whose testimony was unimpeachable. But Donovan Ashworth was not finished. His voice boomed through the cabin, an instrument of pure power. "Let me make sure everyone on this aircraft understands exactly what has happened here," he began, his words promising a reckoning. "My son, Michael, is a certified mathematics genius. He's the youngest person ever inducted into the Mathematics Hall of Fame." The man's voice cut through the cabin's tense silence. "He is traveling to Boston to receive that honor, an honor no 8-year-old in history has ever achieved. This brilliant, innocent child was on his way to make history. Instead, he has been traumatized, humiliated, and criminally framed by adults who judged him based on nothing but the color of his skin." The words landed like physical blows. Passengers who had been so certain of the boy's guilt were now forced to confront the chilling reality of what they had done. They had participated in the persecution of a child prodigy whose achievements surpassed anything most of them would accomplish in their entire lives. But Donovan wasn't finished. The most devastating revelation was yet to come. This woman, Brielle Covington, he continued, his voice dripping with an ice-cold fury, works for my company. She is, or rather, was, an employee of Ashworth Technologies. She racially profiled my son, then deliberately framed him for theft to cover her own prejudice. She used a burner phone to manufacture evidence against a child. She turned an entire airplane cabin into accomplices to her racist persecution. The impact of those words was a shockwave that rippled through the cabin. Brielle wasn't just a random passenger who had made a terrible mistake. She was an employee who had committed a crime against her boss's son. The professional implications, the legal consequences, the personal destruction about to rain down on her was beyond anything she could have imagined in her worst nightmares. Donovan turned to face her directly. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of cold, calculated fury that could shatter empires. Ms. Covington, you are terminated, effective immediately, not just fired, terminated with cause, with no severance, no references, and no possibility of future employment within any company in our network. Our security team will escort you from all company properties. Our legal department will pursue criminal charges for child endangerment, filing a false police report, fraud, and any other charge that can possibly be applied. We will use every resource at our disposal to ensure you face the maximum possible consequences for what you have done to my son. The sentence was passed. Brielle's career, her reputation, her entire future had been obliterated in a single devastating paragraph. But it wasn't just about her job. Donovan Ashworth had the kind of influence that could make her unemployable anywhere in her industry, possibly anywhere in the business world. The passengers who had joined her racist mob now looked absolutely mortified. The courage they had felt as part of a group had evaporated, replaced by the chilling realization they had been attacking the son of a billionaire. Crawford Chen, the elderly businessman who had been so quick to judge, looked ashen, as if he were about to have a heart attack. "Mr. Ashworth," he stammered, I owe your son a sincere apology. I was completely wrong. I'm so sorry." Serafina Williams, the young mother who had recorded parts of the incident, was frantically deleting her videos, her hands trembling with shame that she hadn't defended the child when he needed an ally. Others stared at their shoes, desperate to avoid Donovan Ashworth's gaze, hoping they wouldn't be remembered as part of the mob that had tormented his son. But the most powerful moment came when the handcuffs were finally removed from Michael's tiny wrists. Donovan embraced his son with a fierce protectiveness that only a parent can understand. His voice, which had been so cold and commanding, became soft and warm. "I'm so proud of how you handled yourself, son. You showed them who you really are. You kept your dignity when everyone around you lost theirs." Michael, still emotional but finally safe in his father's arms, looked up with innocent eyes that had seen too much cruelty for one day. "I just wanted to solve my math problems and go to Boston, Daddy. I don't understand why she hurt me." Those words, spoken by a genius who could solve doctoral-level equations but couldn't comprehend adult prejudice, were the most heartbreaking and powerful of the entire ordeal. They captured the innocence that had been assaulted, the confusion that racism creates, and the simple humanity the adults on that plane had forgotten. Justice had been served, not just through legal consequences, but through the complete moral vindication of a child and the total ruin of those who had wronged him. The wheels of justice moved with breathtaking speed. Within hours, Brielle Covington found herself in real handcuffs, a devastating and poetic irony. The charges were staggering: child endangerment, filing false police reports, fraud, and federal charges for interfering with air transportation. Agent Stone's crystal-clear video evidence made a conviction a certainty. Legal experts predicted she would face years in federal prison, followed by civil lawsuits that would bankrupt her for life. But her legal troubles were just the beginning. The agent's footage was released through official channels and detonated across the digital world. The headline was devastating in its simplicity. Corporate executive frames 8-year-old math genius discovers he's her boss's son. The video went viral faster than anything in internet history. the hashtag justice. For Michael began trending worldwide, a global chorus of outrage. Major news networks ran wall-to-wall coverage of what they called the most shocking case of racial profiling ever caught on camera. Brielle's name became synonymous with corporate misconduct and racist persecution. While her world crumbled, Michael's was just beginning its most beautiful chapter. 3 days later, he walked onto the stage at the Mathematics Hall of Fame ceremony in Boston. The standing ovation that greeted him was thunderous, lasting nearly 5 minutes. When he finally stepped up to the microphone, the auditorium fell silent. This 8-year-old boy, who had been handcuffed and humiliated just days before, spoke with a wisdom that brought tears to every eye. "Some people judge you before they know your heart," Michael said, his young voice carrying clearly. "But math doesn't lie, and neither should people. I forgive those who hurt me because that's what makes us better." The simplicity and profound grace of his words left the audience speechless. Here was a boy with every right to be bitter, choosing forgiveness instead. The standing ovation that followed lasted even longer than the first, with many openly weeping. Inspired by his son, Donovan Ashworth announced a transformation of policies at his company, implementing the most comprehensive anti-bias training in corporate America. 2 weeks later came the most significant announcement: the creation of a $100 million scholarship fund to support gifted minority children who might face the kind of prejudice Michael had encountered. The ripple effects were extraordinary. What had started as one woman's vicious persecution of a child had inadvertently sparked a nationwide conversation, leading to systemic changes that would protect countless others. In a perfect and profound irony, Brielle's attempt to harm Michael had ultimately made the world a better, safer place for gifted children everywhere.